Hey everyone, Sam here. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are in the world. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint this coastal landscape. It's inspired by a place called Matauri Bay in northern New Zealand, and it actually started off as a plein air painting a year ago. I painted this outdoors and it's just been sat on my shelf for about a year, and then the other day I decided I'd add some more details to it and I filmed the process. So the first part of this video is me painting outdoors, and then the second part of it is me finishing up this painting in the studio. Now if you'd like to see an extended version of this video, then come across and join me on my Patreon channel, where each month I share a full-length painting tutorial video where I'll show you how to paint a landscape or a seascape from start to finish and show you everything, the whole painting process. But I'm also adding exclusive content as well in between, so things such as this video where I'm just showing you an extended time-lapse video, and it's set to some nice meditation music as well, so pretty chilled out. But I've put the link in the description box below. It's just $5 a month. You can see much more of my painting studio process. Now if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. In the meantime, relax, sit back, and let's roll the tape. This is Matauri Bay, located in northern New Zealand, and it's about a 40-minute drive from where I live. It's just the most epic view. This camera shot doesn't do it justice, but there's a parking space where you can pull up and look at the view, and that's exactly what I did. I set up my painting gear and started to paint this beautiful view. Now I actually painted this a year ago, and I decided to complete it in the studio the other day. I'm painting on an 8x10 linen panel, and these are made by a company called Seascape in the USA at canvaspanels.com. They're absolutely ideal for plein air painting and doing studies and small paintings in your studio. I'm using an alla prima pochade box in order to do my plein air painting, and these are specifically designed for this purpose, although you can also use them in the studio as well. These are all handmade by a person called Ben Haggart, and he lives in the USA, and I've put a link to his website in the description box below. His handmade pochade boxes are just beautiful to use. Now I'm sketching out the composition here using burnt sienna and liquid original, which is the medium I'm using because I'm using oil paint. And it's ideal for painting outdoors because very often the paint will have started to dry a little bit as well, which means you can add some more layers as you finish up your painting. Often great if you want to do some plein air paintings in one session. The oil paint I'm using are Blue Ridge oil paints, and these are an artist quality oil, absolutely beautiful to paint with. I love using these, and the colours I'm using include titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and phthalo green. A reasonably limited palette, but I believe you can paint any landscapes with these colours. Now if you'd like to get your hands on some Blue Ridge oil colours, I've put a link to their website in the description box below. Now through my many years of painting outdoors, I've found that it's best to paint your dark values and shadows first, and then it doesn't matter if the light changes or the sun disappears behind the clouds. You've got something to work with. So I've started off here by painting my shadows in the rocks and the trees first of all. I've mainly been using a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson for the shadows in the islands in the distance and in the rock faces, also some of those trees in the midground. And this makes some great neutral greys. I've also used it here for the sky in the background as well, but with a lot more titanium white. For those trees in the foreground, this is where the darkest values are going to be, and I've used a combination of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre. Now for the sky here, I've used ultramarine blue with a little phthalo green and titanium white, and for the cloud highlights I've used titanium white with some burnt sienna. For the sea, I've used ultramarine blue with some phthalo green, titanium white and even a small amount of yellow ochre. I've mostly been using so far number 5 flat brushes, as you can create some really nice painterly marks with them. The brand of brushes I'm using is Rosemary & Co, and if you'd like to get some Rosemary & Co brushes, I've put the link in the description box below. Now the important thing with a painting like this is to create a sense of depth and scale, and we can do this by paying attention to our values. So in the foreground we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights, but then as landforms recede those shadows aren't as dark, so darks become lighter, and even the lights aren't completely light either. The value scale becomes much narrower as we go into the distance, and even the saturation of the colours is going to be reduced as well. And this is important so that those islands sit back in the distance where they're meant to. As I'm working forward in the painting, I work on the trees and also the grass here. Now trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the painting, in the landscape, so we need to keep this in mind. They need to be darker than the grass, for example, so that they stand out when juxtaposed against the grass. Now for the grass to sit in the midground, I've reduced the chroma of the colour, chroma being another word for saturation, and I've mainly used a mixture of yellow ochre with ultramarine blue, a little cadmium yellow and titanium white. I've also rounded it off with a little bit of alizarin crimson, as the red in alizarin crimson is opposite to green on the colour wheel, so when they're combined they desaturate each other. And this is how we can make the greens keep in check and so that they are not too saturated and stay in the midground as they're meant to. Now for these pine trees in the foreground, the value of the foliage is much darker, as conifer trees tend to be quite dark in value. Trees are also some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape because there's lots of occlusion shadows. So I use the same colours that I used for the grass in the midground, but with a lot less titanium white, and I've also used more cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue in the mix. Now there's lots of different shades of green in this scene, especially within the New Zealand native plants that are growing on the hill. But there's also lots of pine trees here which have been introduced into this country from California. So there's some different variety of greens. But I've mainly kept my greens centred around a core mix of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue and titanium white, rounding it off with either a cadmium orange or an alizarin crimson, and I've been adjusting the values accordingly. If I want to make the green look more olive, then I've used more yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. Or if I want to make the green look more kind of emerald, I've even introduced a little bit of phthalo green into the mix. Now when it comes to painting the grass in the foreground, I've again used these similar colours, but with a lot more titanium white and cadmium yellow in the mix, keeping in mind that the value of the grass needs to be much lighter than the value of the pine trees and the other foliage that's in the midground. Now when I'm painting outdoors on plein air, I try and paint my artworks as quickly as possible, just because the light and the weather conditions are often changing. And the more you paint outdoors, the quicker you get at it, and that even translates into when you're painting in the studio as well. It just gives you more confidence in your work overall. Now when I'm at this stage of the painting where I've basically marked out all the major zones within it, I then just go back across the whole thing and restate the dark, so restating the shadows within the scene and even adding more shadows. As I said, I was using Liquid Original, so some of that paint was already starting to dry and forming a tack that I could add additional layers on top. So as I say, I'm restating some of these shadow areas and it's just adding more form and definition to the whole scene. I'm just tidying up the areas within the painting overall and then even adding finer details such as little trees. Here I'm just adding a bit more details and layers to the grass in the midground, just making sure that that works and is communicating well within the painting. Also adding a little bit more saturated colour to some of these trees and bushes that are in the midground here. Then following this, I added another layer to the pine trees that are in the foreground, again using the same colours I was using just a moment ago, but adding more shape and definition to these pine trees. Now, another thing that I did here was I was smoothing out the horizon line as well, so it's not such a solid line, and then that means it will be less of a distraction in the composition. The last thing I did to finish up the plein air session of this artwork was to add the white water and the breaking waves. And I was saving my lightest values until the end. So here I'm just using some titanium white with just a small amount of burnt sienna mixed in. Now at the time when I was painting this artwork, I wasn't sure whether I was just going to leave it as a plein air painting or whether I'd add some more details to it in the studio. And it's actually sat on my shelf in my studio for about a year, until the other day when I decided I'd add some more details to it to finish it off. Now here I'm just adding some white water around these islands, just helps to give it more form and definition, and even just tidying up things like the clouds in the distance. Matauri Bay is just such a beautiful spot, and this camera shot just does not do the view any justice at all. Anyway, back in the studio 1 year later, the painting is definitely dry. And I'm going over the sky, and I'm going to be adding more details to the scene overall. So the sky here, I'm using the same colours as before, and this was a mix of ultramarine blue, a little phthalo green and titanium white. I'm just tidying up the sky overall, just making it look a bit more pleasing in the composition. I don't want too many distractions in the clouds. I'm using the same colours that I was using in the blocking in stage for these distant clouds, mostly centred around a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a lot of titanium white and just a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I can do things like paint some of these little darker clouds that are just floating in front of those cirrus clouds that are in the background. And then in the far distance here, I'm just painting the highlights on some of these cumulus clouds. I next spent a bit of time working on the sea. I just decided to increase the saturation of the colour a little bit more. Again, I used the same colours that I used during the plein air session of this, and this was a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre, phthalo green and titanium white. I just wanted to give the ocean here a bit more body and texture and just tidy up the areas around those islands. And in fact what I did as well was eliminate one of the islands because it was dead in the middle of the composition and I felt like it was forming a little bit of a distraction. Had to be a bit careful because I don't want it too different from the actual location because I want it to be recognisable as Matauri Bay. But you know, you can use a bit of artistic licence in your paintings. So what I was doing next here was I was readjusting some of these shadows, and in fact I actually made them slightly darker as well and made it so that the shadows have a bit more of a bluish violet cast to them. I paint some more highlights on the islands here, and this was a mix of burnt sienna with some yellow ochre and titanium white. The brushes I'm using are pretty small as well. Here I was using a number 2 flat brush, just adding in some of those finer details. Now for that distant grass on those islands, I was using a mix of yellow ochre with titanium white, a little burnt sienna and some ultramarine blue. Here I wanted to add more body and texture to the pine trees that are in the midground and the foreground. Now as I said before, conifer trees are naturally dark in value, and in some cases there's not that much difference between the areas in shadow and the areas of the foliage that's in the full sunlight. Now again, these colours are mainly centred around a mix of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, titanium white, and then rounded off with either a cadmium orange or alizarin crimson. For the shadows I've again used ultramarine blue and a little bit of yellow ochre. Now that yellow ochre helps to keep the saturation down, but it still gives the shadow a nice green cast to it, so this is perfect for these pine trees and also these New Zealand native plants as well, which really do have some unique green colours to them, especially some of the tree ferns that are growing on the side of the hills. I'm using smaller brushes now, mostly a range of number 3 and number 2 flat brushes and number 3 filbert brushes. Now the cool thing about filbert brushes is these are great for painting foliage because you can still use the broad end of the brush for some gestural marks, but then you can use the rounded edge of the brush for finer marks and communicating things like branches and leaves. Now what I did here was I was adding lighter layers to these bushes to some of those darker tones underneath, and this just helps to communicate the three-dimensional form of these bushes that are in the midground. I then also started painting the suggestion of branches, even clumps of needles within these pine trees here in the midground. I'm getting into much finer detail now. Now of course this is only a small artwork, so I'm not going too crazy with the detail, but just enough to add some more interest within the painting overall. Now going back to the stand of conifer trees that are on the left side of the painting here, I'm adding more details to them, and especially shadows as well. Now when you're painting landscapes and you want to communicate a three-dimensional form, having a few shadows within them, whether it's in the trees or the hills, that really helps to make it look much more realistic. Now if you're new to painting landscapes, painting a scene that has lots of shadows and areas that are in the full sunlight can really help you to get your head around understanding values and creating a tonal dynamic, atmospheric depth within your painting. So here I'm adding these last details to these pine trees, adding more shadows, just building up the forms overall. So I went back and forth a little bit, adding highlights here and there or adding more shadows, just building up the forms of those pine trees. Next I worked on the grass in the foreground and just wanted to add a bit more texture to that as well. Again using the same colours that I used when I was painting it on plein air, but just made the value of these greens darker. So this was a mix of mainly yellow ochre with some cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue and titanium white, and then rounded off with a little bit of cadmium orange. Now I've also found that you can create some quite natural looking grass as well by mixing in more yellow ochre and titanium white. If you just want some lighter value colours where there's some of that straw coloured grass mixed in with the green grass as well. Now at this point in the painting it was very nearly finished, and I was going back across the whole thing, just tidying up areas, adding more details. You can see here that I was just adding another layer to the grass in the midground, and I was just getting into finer details overall. Now I always pretty much save the lightest values until the end of my painting, so here I was using a much smaller number 0 round brush to paint the white water of the breaking waves. I needed a bit more of a steady hand here, so you can see in the corner on the right side of the painting I'm using a mole fork where I can rest my arm on it. This is pretty good if you don't have a steady hand, which I don't. Sometimes my hand can be a little bit shaky, and this can just help you to create some more accurate marks. Now if you want to get hold of some mole forks, you can get them from moleforks.com, and I've put a link in the description box below. So I finished up this painting just by painting the water with those distant islands. Helps to add more to the form and definition. And quite often when I'm painting, I never really know when it's truly finished, and I can just find myself adding a few more details here and there. Like in this case I was just tidying up the sky a little bit more, just adding a bit more definition to those distant cumulus clouds, but it was around this point that I decided the painting was complete. I have to say I really enjoyed painting this. I know it took me a year to finish it, but I was really pleased with the end result. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes, then check out the free painting resources I have on my website at samueler.com. I've got a painting blog there. You can also get a copy of my free ebook, Introduction to Oil Painting, when you subscribe to my email list. I also have full-length painting tutorial videos available for sale from my website, and you can also watch those same videos and more by subscribing to me on Patreon for just $5 a month, where I've got full-length painting tutorial videos and more exclusive content, including time-lapse videos as well, including one of this particular painting. And I'm going to be adding much more content to my Patreon channel to make it really good value for money, to get you inspired and help you with your painting process, all for just $5 a month. click the link in the description box below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave me a comment. I read all my comments and I try and respond to all of them. Thanks for watching. I hope you're inspired and you're going to do some painting. Have a beautiful day and I'll see you in the next video.